Hey YouTube, I've got a 2004 Toyota RAV4 here with the 2.4 inline four-cylinder engine. Today's work involves replacing the thermostat on the engine. The engine is not getting up to operating temperature, and we are getting a code of P0128, which is just complaining about the engine not getting up to operating temperature in a specified amount of time. So not a terrible job here. So first off, we want the engine to cool off. We don't want to burn ourselves on hot coolant. And the second thing we're going to do is get an appropriate sized catch pan of sorts and a hose with inside diameter of 5/16. The 5/16 hose will go onto the end of the radiator petcock right here at the tip of my finger. I hope you can see this. We'll route that hose to the nipple here, and then we'll turn this valve counterclockwise as you're facing the valve, and that'll drain the coolant. And we'll also remove the radiator cap to allow that coolant to flow out a little easier. So what I'll do is I will get that hose routed through. You can see the little access hole that they put in the splash pan here. So I'll route that hose up through the hole here onto the petcock and the other end into my catch pan. Then we will loosen that petcock and get the coolant draining out. All right, it's gonna go something like this. Sorry about the crappy camera work here. It's pretty tight quarters. Okay, radiator cap off and petcock's open. We may need to force some compressed air into the hose here to get the coolant flow going. All right, so we've got the coolant slowly draining out. We'll let this go until it stops. The radiator cap's off to facilitate that. And we've got the catch pan underneath the vehicle here. And if you have a large enough catch pan, you can go ahead and just pull the whole petcock out and just let it drain. That's usually a little faster than using the hose method. But we'll go ahead and let this drain until it's out and done. And we'll catch you in the next video segment here. All right, the next step, once you have the coolant sufficiently drained from the radiator and the engine block, is to get to the two 10mm nuts here. There's one on top of the thermostat housing and another just below it, kind of in between the AC compressor and the bottom of this thermostat housing. Unfortunately, you can't squeeze a camera in there too well, but there is a second 10mm nut there. Loosen those and that housing should come right off. Okay, so Toyota threw us in for a loop here. We cannot get this out because we've got studs coming out of the block right where my index finger is. I don't know if you can see that. But there is absolutely no way we're going to get this out with the AC compressor in place. So, because my channel is more dedicated to the do-it-yourselfers, I'm going to see if I can figure out a way to do this without having to move the AC compressor out of the way. And I think I can make it happen if I remove the stud going into the engine block. So that's going to require an E-torque socket, which is an E5. So what I'll do is I'll try to get this stud unscrewed from the block. Maybe that'll give us just enough angle to get this housing out of the way. So go ahead and get it out of the block. So what I'll do is I'll get it out of the block and we'll continue with the camera footage once I have that out. All right, so it appears that removing that upper stud was just the trick we needed to get this thermostat housing out of the way enough to be able to get to the thermostat. Of course, with me running the camera one-handed, I can't do this exactly all that well. So let me resituate myself and turn the camera back on when I have everything in order. Okay, so we had to remove the alternator belt. All right, loosen the upper bolt on the alternator here and remove the one on the bottom so that this alternator will pivot out of the way. So once it's pivoted out of the way, the thermostat housing comes apart. And I will have a video on how to get this serpentine belt off of the alternator. But anyway, so we got the thermostat housing off, and now down here, down there is your thermostat. All right, notice that the bobble pin, or the jiggle pin as they call it, is mounted in the 12 o'clock position. So we'll go ahead and pull this thermostat out and take a look. All right, so pulling out the thermostat. Hopefully my little drain pan is in the right spot. Sounds like it. So what we have left here is the gasket. We want to make sure we take this gasket out before we put the new thermostat in. It's just like an oil filter. You double gasket it, you're going to have a major leak. So I'll go ahead and rip this out. All right, and then from here we will clean out the aperture here, clean the thermostat housing right here, and proceed with reinstalling everything. Alrighty, so we've got the engine block cleaned out. I've got the new thermostat ready to go. Go ahead and insert it into the hole, keeping note of where the jiggle pin is. We want that pointing in the 12 o'clock position. Once we do that, we can offer the thermostat housing back on. I still need to clean it, so I will go ahead and do that before I roll that back in there. We just want to make sure all the sealing surfaces are clean so that we can ensure that we don't have any coolant leaks in the future. All right, I've got the thermostat housing back up against the engine block. I started threading this upper stud back into the block. I'm just going to tighten it with this E-torque socket. Again, this is an E5, and there's not a whole lot of torque on this guy. Basically, as soon as you start feeling resistance, you're done. I don't remember what the torque spec is on the top of my head, but basically you thread that in until it starts giving you resistance. Do not go any tighter than that because you will snap it off in the block. So as you can see there, it just stopped. Now we can put the 10mm nuts back on the top here and on the bottom and snug those down. And I will have the torque specs listed in the comments section below. Okay, so here's the first one. I will note that the bottom one is a bit difficult to get to, and I ended up using a flex head gear wrench to get to it. Basically one of these guys, but in 10mm. So I'm going to go ahead and tighten that bottom one here, and we'll go from there. All right, just an example of what I'm doing to tighten this lower nut. I've got this flex head gear wrench down here. Sorry if the focus isn't on here very well. My iPhone's not the greatest at focusing. So anyway, getting the lower nut tightened. Flex head is essential here because you can bend the head as necessary to clear any obstructions like the exhaust manifold. All right, so bottom one's snug. Now we're going to work on this top one, which is fortunately a lot easier to get to. So it goes a little something like this. The camera in the way, I can't really see what I'm doing, but you get the gist of things. These do not take a whole lot of torque. We got that O-ring gasket. So I don't know if I showed it earlier, but here's the old thermostat. The gasket goes around, and there's a little groove in there's a little groove in this rubber gasket that the O-ring or the thermostat sits in. So basically you align the jiggle pin to the 12 o'clock position and stick it into the block. So sometimes the gasket does come off separately of the thermostat like it did earlier in the video, but I just thought I would mention that in case it is not clear as to how these things go together. So I'm going to do some final torquing on the thermostat housing here. Again, it's not very tight as it's only a little 10 millimeter nut on both ends here. As you can see here, I've got the dipstick bracket loosened. I did that just to give myself more space for the camera. I don't believe you need to take that loose to do this job. But I'll go ahead and put this dipstick tube back together, and then we'll work on getting the alternator back into place and the belt on, and we'll go from there. Okay, so we've got the thermostat housing torqued to spec. Now it's just a matter of putting the alternator and everything that we took off, like the serpentine belt, back together. So as you can see here, the alternator is rotating on its upper bolt. So right where my index finger is. Don't know if you can see it. So there's a 14 millimeter bolt on the top here. Can't really see it all that well because this engine compartment is dark and really tight, but trust me, underneath this gray connector is a 14 millimeter bolt. So we have that loosened right now so that the alternator can pivot on here. Now there is a 12 millimeter head bolt that is for the lower mounting point. And now we've just got to jiggle this in place, run the bolt through the alternator bracket, and we are basically fishing by braille here. So stick the bolt in its hole. And unfortunately I cannot get it. There's no way I can get a clear video footage as to where this bolt is located. You're just gonna have to trust me on this. You got the upper bolt right here. The lower bolt is underneath at approximately the 6 o'clock position, as it is 6 o'clock in relation to the alternator itself. So what I'm doing is I am tightening it by hand. Once I get this threaded on, we will snug it down. And this will definitely test your patience. What I used here is a deep 12 millimeter socket to get to the bolt down here, and a low drag snap-on ratchet. As you can see here, there's barely enough space to get going. And the reason why you want a low drag ratchet is so that when you go backwards, it actually ratchets. If you use something that's not a low drag, you're just gonna frustrate yourself. Because as you try to go backwards with, like, say, a Craftsman ratchet, it'll actually have enough drag on the ratchet mechanism to loosen the bolt. And what we're trying to do here is tighten the bolt. So if you can afford one, get a nice low drag ratchet for this job, or borrow one. So we're gonna snug this down to about where it was when we removed it. So that's about the right torque. Again, torque specs will be listed in the comment section. 14 millimeter to tighten the upper mounting bolt. Again, flex head ratchet, very important on these tight engine compartments, because as you can see here, I'm moving it out of the way of the obstruction. So that's torque to spec. From here, we'll have to realign the cameras so that you can see how we get the belt around the alternator. All right, so the next step of the story here is to get this serpentine belt back around the alternator pulley. And in order to do that, we need to release tension off of the tensioner. This is the, right where my middle finger is, that is the bolt head that you put your tensioner tool on to compress the hydraulic belt tensioner. And what we are using for that is this serpentine belt tool. You can get this from Napa or your auto parts store. And we have a 19 millimeter socket here. And what that does is it'll fit on about like that. So it's a long handle. The hydraulic tensioner actually has quite a bit of force on it. And I'm a 200-pound guy, and I'm putting a decent amount of weight on it. So we hold, so as you can see there, when I released tension, it sprung back into position. So, and you cannot pull this quickly. I'm fighting it. So I'm helping my assistant there. We'll hold the tensioner in place, which gets the belt loose enough that you can thread it back around. And if your deity of choice is cooperating with you, you can get the belt back around to where it needs to be. And as you can see here, my deity of choice is not cooperating with me, he's laughing at me. The belt fell off the AC pulley, so I'm gonna have to turn the camera off, get everything reconfigured, and once everything looks correct, I will turn the camera back on. Okay, after a couple of minutes with screwing around with the belt, I got the belt back on its pulleys. So there's the alternator pulley, the water pump, the AC compressor, the belt tensioner pulley, and down in the darkness over there is the power steering pump. Everything is lined up correctly, so now we can release tension on the belt tensioner tool. So just release it slowly. And if you did your job right, tensioner tool should come right off. Again, very important, make sure all of your belts are lined up and in the grooves on the respective pulleys. If not, loosen the tensioner again and reconfigure the belt. So off camera, I'm gonna make sure it didn't fall off of the power steering pump, and we'll go from there. Now that we have the belt squared away, alternator's back where it needs to be, everything's plugged in, the dipstick tube is reattached to the block, thermostat housing is tightened, we can proceed with putting the petcock back into the radiator. And it's only plastic, so there's no need to crank on it. Finger tight is all you need to do. From here, we will proceed with filling the radiator up. So I like to use a funnel. I got this fancy dancy funnel, my favorite coolant funnel. I'll have a link to in the description below if you'd like to buy one of these, but it's pretty fancy. So it's called a spill-free funnel. So it sits on the radiator like this very nicely. We could pull the plug on it and we could start pouring the antifreeze mixture. So the correct antifreeze mixture to use on this vehicle is the Toyota Long Life coolant. It is red in color. You can either get the genuine Toyota brand or go to your parts store and get the Xerox equivalent, or there's also other manufacturers that make a compatible coolant. Whatever the case, you definitely want to use the prescribed Toyota type coolant. Do not use the green Prestone or Walmart stuff. Your Toyota will not be happy. Use the correct antifreeze. Okay, so before we even start the vehicle, we will just do an initial fill with the coolant here. The Toyota red/pink colored coolant. And you just slowly fill it until it just won't take anymore. Should take about a gallon or so, roughly. If you don't already have the pre-mix 50-50, you're gonna wanna mix it with distilled water, 50% distilled water, 50% concentrated coolant. But in this case, the parts house only had the 50-50 mix, so that's what I'm using. And we have the slow process of filling. I'm not going to bore you with the entire process, so we'll start the camera when we're ready to go for the next clip. All right, so we are about 1.25 gallons into it, and we finally got it to stop burping here. This is again with the engine off, cold engine. So what I'll do here is I'll just squeeze the upper and lower hoses slowly and just see if we can get any more air to come out. And we'll do the same with the lower hose. All right, we're not getting any air. And this is one thing I like about this funnel is it doesn't leak. You know, you can give it a slight overfill, and that really helps with purging the air out of the system. Unlike a lot of American and European vehicles, these Toyotas don't generally have issues with having to bleed the air out of the system. You could do it just like this. So what we'll do now is we will start the engine and turn the heater on hot and just let it warm up naturally. So hopefully you can hear me. The engine is running. We just have it idling. Heater is on high, and we are just going to let this thing purge itself. As you can see, a little bit more air bubbles are coming out. So we'll just do this until the engine gets nice and warm. We'll make sure we don't have any leaks. And we'll just let this purge all the air out. You can help it by squeezing the hoses, but it's just best to let it idle until it gets warmed up. You might want to have somebody sit in the driver's seat just to monitor the temperature gauge. But if you do it this way, where you give it a nice cold fill first and then start it up, you shouldn't have any problems with it trying to overheat. As you can see here, we're getting some air bubbles out, and that's normal. So what I'll do is I'll just let this warm up, and go from there. One thing to note is you just want to have a little bit of fluid in here just to help with the purging process, the bleeding process. If we get some large air bubbles through that reduces the fluid level down, I'll just pour a little bit more antifreeze in here, not much more than this. You just want to have it above the level of the radiator just to get a good purge. So we'll let this warm up, and I'll start the camera back up once we are at a point where I feel we need to start videoing again. All right, it's been about 15 minutes of idling here. As you can see, we're no longer getting the big air bubbles in the funnel here. The heater is nice and hot. The radiator hoses are nice and hot. I'm not going to reach down here on camera because I don't want to get my hand caught in the fan. Something I noticed earlier is I didn't have this ground wire hooked up, so make sure you check your work, double check it if you need to, but yeah, this ground wire was not hooked up. I hooked it up. Everything that I messed with is all hooked up. So now that we are at operating temperature, I'm going to go ahead and plug in the funnel. Plug the funnel. I'm going to remove the adapter here and put the radiator cap back on. And we're going to take it for a test drive and see if the check engine light goes away. And we'll just get some scan data on there and make sure the engine is warmed up. All right, I plugged in and got some scan data. We are getting to 185 degrees for the engine coolant temperature. Cruising around, it was jumping anywhere between 191 and 184, something like that. So the thermostat was doing its thing, opening and closing as it should. The check engine light went away on its own. I didn't have to clear the codes, so that's good. The temperature gauge is sitting right around middle, which indicates normal operating temperature for these Toyotas. Prior to working on it, it never got it never got above the quarter mark. So that was an indication to me that the thermostat was stuck open. And again, the warning lights are all gone. Unfortunately, I didn't get footage of the lights beforehand. Heater works nice and hot. Is nice and hot now. We do not have any leaks anywhere here. The coolant reservoir is full. Radiator cap's on. We're holding pressure nicely. So I'm going to call this a win. This is a good fix. So anyway, I hope this video was helpful to you guys. If you like this video, please click the like button, and if you haven't already, please subscribe so you can see more content like this. I try to get a couple of videos a month or so, just as time permits. Try to get different types of vehicles, like in this case is a Toyota. Usually I'm working on European or domestic stuff. But anyway, I try to get everything that I work on. So, hope you guys are having a good day, and we will see you next time.